Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hoin on June 3rd, 2020, and I wanted to record this video as much for my students as all my past students, future students, as well as my own children and grandchildren and so on and so forth. I think it's really important to mark the events that have taken place in our country over the last several days and provide a commentary and context to it all, not just as a history teacher, but as a citizen of this nation. And I wanted to go over a couple of things. First of all, a quick review as to where we are. It's June 3rd, 2020. The country has more or less settled down after several days of violent protests in some cases, but generally peaceful demonstrations that I think we'll continue to see for a while in regards to the series of events that have taken place over the last 3 months that has really been triggered by the deaths of these three people. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And after the George Floyd death at the hands of Minneapolis police, we began to see an outbreak of looting and violence and destruction of public property in protest of George Floyd's death. And that really bummed me out to see the extent of violence. I've seen pockets of violence break out over the course of my lifetime, but nothing to the extent that occurred over those first couple days. And that was terribly upsetting to me, as well as I hope all of you. But more importantly, what happened is this. Over 360 some odd cities in the United States saw a series of peaceful protests where people came out to demonstrate their frustration and anger at a country that continues to not address the bigger racial issues and disparities that persist in the United States. And I want to make sure that everyone understands something, that this outbreak of violent protests at the beginning and the bigger series of nonviolent protests that have happened even up to today don't necessarily stem from the deaths of these three individuals. What you see is a protest against the bigger story of racial disparities in the United States. And that have taken place over the course of even before we were a country. Stemming from the very first black African that was ever sold on American soil up until June 3rd, 2020, black people in the United States have generally been discriminated against, segregated against. We would like to believe that in 2020, and after having elected a black president twice, that we would have reached a greater racial equality. But that is clearly not the case in 2020. And what you see are protests not necessarily directed at these deaths of these three black people. This has been building for a very long time. And the racial disparities that exist in our country relative to wealth, employment, health, education, law enforcement, have proved that the level playing field that our government alleges we have is not existent, and nor has it ever been. That's why people are protesting. And if you need evidence of that, I have it. In regards of household wealth, this is a staggering number. White families have virtually 10 times the wealth of black families, and of course that has a history that extends hundreds of years in this country. with seemingly no improvement. Unemployment as of April 2020, clearly as a result of the pandemic, we have a wild increase of unemployment, but it has hit the black community harder than the white. As you can see here, 14% roughly of white Americans are unemployed versus almost 17% of black Americans. In regards to health care, we're almost double the amount of black people lack health insurance compared to whites. And if you look at the numbers relative to pandemic deaths, black people have experienced a far greater share of COVID-related deaths than whites. Let's look at the education achievement gap in your state. There are some graphs here that were generated within the last year in regards to the achievement gap that exists between Asians and whites and black and Hispanics relative to standardized testing for 8th graders. This is relative through grades 3 through 8. English and math. And what you see is a very wide gap between the achievements of whites versus non-whites. So this is the evidence that sort of indicates the bigger picture of America in 2020. And these racial disparities have been long time brewing and now have escalated to the point of mass protest. Not just here in the United States, but all across the world. The world is watching the United States right now and is shocked at what they've seen, just as all of us are. Relative to police brutality against blacks, this slide illustrates that black Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than white Americans. It's a staggering number. And again, this was finally escalated to the point of the George Floyd killing, but of course this has gone on for literally hundreds of years and seemingly hasn't improved. And then you have this guy right here, President Trump, who for better or worse is our president. And yet the things that he continues to say clearly demonstrates a lack of leadership, compassion for Americans. And some of the things that he has said in the last couple of days with all of the events that have taken place is not just disheartening, it's shocking. And I hope all of you are as upset as I am relative to the terrible leadership of this man. You can see in these quotes here that he's not far off than some of the worst dictators that have taken place in world history, who have used violence against their own people or encouraged that, which you can see by the quotes that are on the screen here. President Trump has clearly never had compassion for all Americans. He believes he does, but his words and actions have never supported that. If there's any bigger lesson that I've learned in my life after 60 years, and all of you will inevitably learn this lesson, is that leadership is key to how society runs. And not just society relative to our communities, but businesses, schools, hospitals. How organizations and institutions are led very much results in success or failure. Over the last 3 years, this guy here has demonstrated extraordinary poor leadership. And I've grown tired of it, and I hope all of you are as well. He had the audacity to hold up a Bible in front of a church that was looted across the street from the White House Secret Service used tear gas on peaceful protesters to clear the area so he can have this photo op. This is one of the least religious individuals in America, and the fact that he's using a Bible as a prop and a church as a background to make a political statement is nothing short of one of the most shocking things I've seen in U.S. history. So listen, what I think the bigger lesson needs to be taken from all of this is this. For better or worse, the United States is your country, and it has provided all of you with incredible opportunities. Some of which, as young adults, you haven't taken advantage of, and I hope you will in time. But there's some bigger lessons to be learned through all of this. And one is not to be ignorant of what's happening in your country and your communities. It's critical that all of us play a part in what goes on, for better or worse. And I have three specific requests for you, my students, in all of this. First of all, we can't forget that we're still living under a pandemic. It'll be really interesting to see, in fact, how the numbers play out given the massive amounts of protest and violation of social distancing that has happened over the course of the last week as part of this protest movement. But we are still living under a pandemic, and this virus is not going away anytime soon until we get a mass vaccination in place. So I need all of you to respect that and continue to practice social distancing and good hygiene. All of you need to stay informed about what's going on in your world. I've said this multiple times, but it's probably even more important now. All of you someday will have to explain all of this to your children and your children's children. And the only way to put all of this into context is to read the news. And when I say read the news, you need to be careful of your biases, not to inform yourself based on information that you want to hear. You need to hear both sides. And you need to avoid social media crap. Social media has proven a terrible place to gain information about what's going on in our world. There's far too much fake news there. And you need to avoid the lies of President Trump. This is a president that believes all news is fake news unless it touts or glorifies him. And that is not good leadership. You also need to not be passive in all of this. You need to get involved. Through any example of social change that I've seen in U.S. history, if not world history, social change only happens when society organizes for change and demands it through their legislatures and follows up with that. When their legislators can't enact the change that the people want, it's time to get different legislatures through voting. So these are the essential things that I'm asking all of you to keep in mind as you continue to grow and be a part of your community and this world and our country. That's all I have to say about this. I hope all of you continue to stay well. And more importantly, please stay in touch with me as you continue to work on your final projects. Have a good one, everybody.